Welcome. My name is Natasha Sherman, and I am your host. And my guest today is Dr. Dion Johnson. She is the owner and CEO of Juvenile and Adult Reentry Connections. Subsequent to obtaining a master's degree in marriage and family therapy from California State University, Dr. Johnson obtained her master's degree in theology and a PhD in clinical psychology from Fuller Theological Seminary in California. Her work has allowed her to provide services in various mental health outpatient clinics, inpatient forensic hospital settings, community crisis response teams, correctional facilities, residential and group home placements, and with parole probation agencies and family courts.
Phew.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
Pretty impressive, huh?
I didn't realize how busy I've been over the last 20 years. Thank you.
Yeah, that is pretty impressive. And, you've impacted a huge segment of the population.
Yeah.
So right now you are the owner and CEO of Juvenile and Adult Reentry Connections. Let's talk about what that is and why you are doing it.
Okay, Juvenile and Adult Reentry Connections, or JARC for short, is committed to providing reentry services for those coming home from residential and or correctional facilities such as jails or prisons, for those who also have behavioral health needs. So our services are unique in the sense that we only focus on reentry needs.
And what had you choose that?
Well, I really think that it's important to provide folks with a holistic approach to treatment. As you've already recalled, I've worked with individuals in a variety of settings since 1999. And one of the things that I've found that people really benefit from are holistic approaches to treatment that really kind of speak to what their needs are.
And this population intrigued you for, is it because it occurs to me that there are very few places that offer this specifically.
Yes.
And again, I've interviewed people, in the prison system, from the prison system, who have been inmates. And one of the things where we fail miserably is in rehabilitation.
Yes.
So we lock them up, we put them in this box, and often they're mistreated, abused. It's like there's no education in there for the most part. And then most of them are coming out.
Yes.
And we somehow think we don't have to think about it because they're over there. But when they come out, if they haven't had any rehabilitation, they're coming out the same or worse than when they went in.
Yes.
And then being out in society and doing the things that they were doing before.
Yes.
So in working with this population, it occurs to me like it fills a huge need.
Yes. Yes. Most recently, I was mental health director at one of the state's county correctional facilities. And, one of the best ways to ensure, or one of the factors that really increases the likelihood of folks reoffending, is to really not provide any follow-up services once folks go home. Now, I'm a big proponent of people being accountable for their actions. Whatever it is, we all need to be accountable. However, if we see that people have issues with addiction or issues with trauma, or if we see that people have issues with really understanding how to approach becoming gainfully employed, I think that the onus is up to those of us who say that we're committed to this work to really kind of be about what we say we're about. Hence the impetus for Juvenile and Adult Reentry Connections. As you've already recalled, I've worked in a lot of different settings. And the ball really seems to drop from a service perspective, in my opinion, once people go home.
I think so.
And I think, while folks do need to do their part to be accountable, I think that there needs to be a community of reentry as well. Not just within our lay communities, but within our professional community environment too.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. They have to be accountable, and we do make choices moment by moment. And so you either choose to reach for what's available or search for or be a demand for. Or you kind of take the path of least resistance. The issue, though, for me is, I've interviewed recovering addicts, and one of the things one of them said was, it never occurred to me that that would be possible for me. So I think that's part of the problem, is they're not even aware that it's a possibility.
Yes. How we think about ourselves has a direct influence or consequence on our behaviors.
Yes.
And so that's interesting you brought that up, Natasha, because this morning I was thinking about, what exactly makes juvenile and adult reentry connections unique, or more generally, what are some of the things that really kind of impact folks' tendency to reoffend or even to relapse? And I don't necessarily think it's due to, not always, a lack of available resources. I can't tell you how many people that I've worked with over the years who have been to a number of substance abuse programs and treatment alternatives. And for them, it's not necessarily that they don't know what they should do cognitively.
Right.
It has to translate into a behavior change, an
Yes.
attitude change, a shift. And for many folks, it's hard for them to see themselves sober
Yes.
on the other side of the law.
Yeah.
So I found that in our work, it's really important to shift or to address attitudes and beliefs about how one sees themselves, because that just doesn't happen overnight.
Tell me about it. I'm a coach, and for me, again, it's what do you believe about yourself?
Yes.
And again, I keep pointing out, when you were lying in that crib,
Right.
You weren't thinking that you had all these limitations and you couldn't, and somebody else was better than you. So it was all learned, and it can
Yes.
be unlearned. And
Bingo.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I was working with a young man in my position as mental health director at a correctional facility. He was maybe 25, 26. So he was telling me about how when he went home, he really wanted to turn the corner in his life and engage in a more legal lifestyle. So we started working on job readiness, social skills modeling, because he had never been in
Yes.
a legitimate workplace, least of all in an interview. So when we got to the point of the salary negotiation, he just stopped and he said, "Dr. Johnson, jobs are pissing people off like that? That's what they're paying people?" And I mean, it just really reminded me, this is a huge paradigm shift
Yes.
for someone like him. And I said, yeah. He said, "Do you know I can make that in 10 minutes, what they want to pay me for a week?" And it's that kind of shift that a lot of folks struggle to make.
Yes.
Because it doesn't come easy within a more legitimate context
Yes.
the way it does in that
Yeah.
illegitimate way of
Yeah.
living.
So it's looking at the trade-offs.
Yes, exactly. And for him, I said, well, that may be true. You won't earn that kind of money that readily, but you get to sleep at night with peace of mind. You don't have to worry about or be distracted by someone coming into your home, either law enforcement or opposing gang members. You get to walk out of your door, get into your car for all intents and purposes, and pull off without necessarily doing a check to see if somebody's following you,
Yeah.
or even if there's some kind of
And I think even that sometimes doesn't occur like a big enough payoff to make the change,
Right.
But again, it's everybody's personal choice. You can
Yes.
only lead them to the buffet, and then they have to
Yes.
choose what to eat. But you're
Yes.
also training them to make better choices.
Yes.
And I think one of the things, it occurred to me when I looked at your website, I mean, you cover the whole spectrum of the population. And I
Yes.
think to myself, how can she work with sex offenders and drug addicts and criminal, et cetera, and be effective in all of those? And then what you really get is they're all human beings.
Yes.
And it's really kind of, again, looking at what caused this, what behavioral
Yes.
change needs to be made,
Bingo.
and also working with the whole family.
Yes.
And I also like the idea that you don't intermix adolescents with adults.
No.
And sometimes even males and females aren't in the same groups. But it's really kind of starting at the root causes.
Yes. Yeah. I would say the most common thread that is within all of the different subpopulations of those who are reentering is that most of the folks who we treat have significant trauma histories.
Yeah.
And so the various ways that individuals try to cope with that trauma could be through addiction. For those who have sexually offended against others, not all the time, but oftentimes they're reenacting what trauma was done to them because that was normalized to them. Or even men and women who've been home 5-10 years who are struggling to reconnect with their children because of those fractured or broken attachment relationships due to their incarcerations. And so it's about finding that common thread, helping folks figure out, how can I make better choices? How can I more effectively cope with what happened to me? And how can I move forward in a positive way?
So it occurs like a daunting task, but clearly you have a passion for it.
Yes.
So what are the biggest challenges? Like, there must be certain segments of the population that it's tougher to rehabilitate than others.
Yes.
So who would you say that is?
To be honest with you, I would say working with adolescents has to be one of the biggest challenges.
Wow.
Because, you know, it's not just about helping them to engage in a paradigm shift or a behavior change. It's really tough, or can be tough, to engage the entire family system of which they are a part. So while the literature suggests that, you know, it's worthwhile and that actually does help to lessen recidivism when you utilize a holistic approach in working with adolescents, the whole family system, that can be tough. Because while the adolescent may want to shift, the larger system around them may be resistant to that change and that shift as well.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you do your best to rehabilitate and to provide treatment alternatives and other ways of coping. Many of our adolescent correctional and residential facilities, that's their aim. But when we send folks, adolescents in particular, right back to the same pathological environments that elicited that criminal behavior, that's challenging. I would say that's the most challenging. Some of the other challenges that I find in working with this population is that many people are very concerned, appropriately so, with their survival needs. So employment, transportation, access to employment, access to transportation, that while engaging in wanting to abide by some of those parole and probation requirements to participate in behavioral health counseling, you know, if folks are struggling to try and put food on their table, sometimes going to see your psychiatrist or case manager is at the bottom of the list.
So who pays for these, your patient population?
85 to 90% of our population receive state Medicaid assistance. So our company bids and competes for state contracts with Medicaid.
Right. You know, it's interesting about finding employment. Just before the show, I was talking to someone who mentioned that he had met with an HR attorney who said that New Jersey recently passed a law that says on an application form you can't ask if the person has a criminal record. Is that the case?
Yes, that measure is called Ban the Box. And the aim of that measure, or initiative rather, or law, is to increase the likelihood of those who have these criminal histories and felony records of obtaining gainful employment. Because unfortunately, for sometimes legitimate concerns and reasons, when a potential employer sees that someone has a felony record or even a misdemeanor, there's pause or even resistance to want to follow through with a potential applicant.
So I'm assuming there's always, you know, because we do background checks, so then that will come out.
Yes.
It's just you've gotten a little further before the pause comes.
Right.
Yeah.
Because one of the ways that a potential employer could notice a red flag or concern is by looking at someone's resume, significant gaps in time frame or employment history.
Right.
And so by banning the box, that hopefully will give those who may otherwise be marginalized or not given as fair an opportunity to compete.
Do you think that's changed things? Changed the results in any way?
I do. I do. I think that if for nothing else, for our population, I think they feel less marginalized. I think they feel less closed out. I think many will actually and do feel like they actually have a chance to compete.
Right. And I assume also that it at least is the impetus for them to try, as opposed to what's the point?
Exactly. And sometimes that impetus to at least try and give it an effort, sometimes that's all folks need.
Yeah.
That's exactly it, Natasha.
Yeah. So one of the things, and you and I met, in the end, I mean, basically my goal here is to give people food for thought, but
Yes.
also to know what the resources are, and also to get invested in recognizing that this impacts them, whether they like it or not.
Yes.
They may not see it directly, but if
Yes.
people aren't being rehabilitated,
Right.
they're going to feel the impact somewhere along the way.
Yes.
So the other thing is, when you and I met before, we talked about sex offenders.
Yes.
And there is a very low rate of success, particularly with pedophiles, in
Yes.
terms of rehabilitation.
Yes.
And you said something very interesting. I asked you, how do you deal with them? Because, first of all, for most of us, we would want to reach over and strangle them. And you said that you see their humanity, which is
Yes.
like truly a gift. But at the same time, you can't, again, there are consequences. It's not
Yes.
like, okay, I forgive you, and what you did is, it's in the past,
Right.
because it's not.
Right.
So they have to be held accountable,
Yes.
and the reins have to be held in by society in whatever
And
way.
parole and probation.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, but when I asked you, like, how do you treat them differently, or what holds them in line? And your answer was?
I think that for many folks, sometimes just the concern with consequences.
Right.
Most people who I've, worked with over the years, they'll tell me even a second in prison is too long, although you've done something
Right.
to warrant that time.
Right.
So people don't want to go back to prison. And so if you don't want to go back to prison, or if you don't want to risk going back to prison, we need to work back with, okay, so this really is in your control whether or not you go back to prison. So how can you use your control and power appropriately to lessen the likelihood of you going back to prison?
Right.
I.e., what kinds of behavior changes do we need to make together? Do I need to help you make? Does my staff need to help you engage in to lessen the likelihood of going back to prison? I think once people really begin to own or internalize their behavior change for themselves, even if it's the threat of external consequences, that's when the shift can really occur.
Right. So, one of the things that I hear in what you say, besides people taking ownership of their
Yes.
behavior, it's kind of enrolling them in the idea that they can succeed,
Yes.
but also enrolling them in getting invested in their own success.
Yes, exactly. I believe that each one of us every day is a new opportunity to do things a little bit differently and a little bit better than what we did the day before. Yesterday has passed, tomorrow's not here, today more often than not is all we have. So how can we make the most out of our moment right now? What needs to shift? What needs to change to help you own your change differently and to help you move forward, even in a small incremental way, toward that end goal
Yes.
that you want?
Yes. And is that a hard sell?
It can be, especially for folks who have been oppressed, downtrodden, who've been disappointed for much of their lives. Much of that disappointment comes from early family and childhood experiences, early experiences with caregivers, which have unfortunately negatively reinforced to them that they're not worthy, that they're not good enough, that they're not capable. So once we kind of wade our way through and begin to shift some of those self-perceptions.
That, that whole issue of self-worth, I mean,
Yes.
it's just so pivotal
Yes.
in our choices. And, it's like women in abusive situations,
Yes.
and it's, for some of us, it's hard to fathom allowing that to happen, but it's not usually an immediate thing. It's a progression. Right. And then women become, and even men,
Yes.
become debilitated, and their self-esteem is so low and their fear level is so high.
Yes.
That it's almost impossible.
Yes. I've had one of the young adolescents who we work with currently, she just told me she's not afraid of death. And so, if whatever happens to her, 17 happens to her. She just goes about her life doing things as status quo, outside of the fact that she's gang affiliated, outside of the fact that at times she fans the flames. So for her, in our work, it's really about helping her, hopefully, to shift that she can see herself outside of this, which she doesn't, because all of her life experiences up until this point have been filled with trauma, loss, and disappointment. And so she just thinks that's her course in life. I asked her where she saw herself 5 years from now when we were in session, maybe a couple months ago. She said, Dr. Johnson, I don't even see myself 2 years from now. Someone who's not even 18 yet. So those attitudes about self and perceptions of self, that's, I would say, the main area of treatment that rehabilitative work should focus on with this population.
Yeah, it's just jaw-dropping to think that you can, at 17, say, okay, if I die, I die.
Be so fatalistic, absolutely.
Yeah. And not have a vested interest in, you can't even see the possibility.
Not even the possibility, Natasha. Already at 17. And this is what we're tasked with when we think about our young folks or even adults, but in particular our adolescents who are being adjudicated, who are coming home. You come home with that kind of fatalistic attitude, what's the likelihood that you are going to do anything differently or even change?
You know, it's interesting because I interviewed, and I've mentioned this before, he was a white Aryan supremacist who ran a hate line. And you know, fast forward, he now is part of an organization called Life After Hate. But when I said to him, was there anything anyone along the way could have said to you that would have made a difference, that would have had like a light bulb go on, like, what am I doing? And he said no, because what was being provided to him was so powerful that everything else paled in comparison, and that was identity and belonging.
Yes, right, exactly. And so, and that's another part of the shift in terms of a lifestyle change that increases or lessens the likelihood potentially of reoffending. You have to really change your reference group or be mindful of your peers, of who you're around, because everyone wants to feel like they can identify and connect with someone. No matter how negative or positive, we all need to feel like we belong. And
the environment wins.
Yes.
So if that's the environment you're surrounding yourself with. I remember having a trainer who said, you want to be rich? Hang around with rich people.
Yes.
Because they think differently than you do.
Yes.
Simply not because they're going to give you money, but they think differently.
Right.
And so it's the same thing. But that's a tough battle to fight, because that longing to belong and to feel connected. And then if you do, in a group that doesn't support you coming out of it, it occurs to me like Herculean.
And that's the catch-22 for a lot of folks who are coming home, re-entering or attempting to re-enter back into society. If the reference group is still stuck in those criminal ways of thinking and attitudes, sometimes people will sabotage their own progress or their own movement forward.
Yes.
No matter how negative or positive is what you know.
Yes.
And so that's always that weird kind of tension or dialectic.
It's true. I remember seeing this, interviewing this guy who teaches in prisons, and he said, so I saw some of the guys being interviewed, and one of them said, I was a smart kid, but it wasn't cool to be smart, so I dumbed myself down, you know. Here's the thing. We have a few minutes left, and I think, again, it's really to provoke thinking, but I think one of the things, and you and I have talked about this, is looking at prevention.
Yes.
And it's the idea of we have to get committed to doing life differently. We have to get committed to embracing diversity, to teaching our children about including one another, because that whole thing of belonging is like, we'll have people kill for a sense of belonging, you know?
Yes.
So we have to create an atmosphere, a culture of belonging, of embracing, of including. And it doesn't mean you have to love everybody.
Right.
It just means you have to treat them in a particular way.
Yes. A community of reentry,
Yeah.
so to speak. And so, you know, it's one thing for us to give lip service and to say that we believe in reentry efforts. But when people come home and you find out that they have an offense record, I'm not even talking about those who engage in sexual offending behaviors,
right.
but even our housing practices are biased toward folks who have these felony records. Employment practices.
And I think it's also in
used to be.
society in
Yes.
general. I mean, we sit back and watch these conversations,
Yes.
and we're even thinking, we agree to them, and we think, yes, something should be done. But I would assert that what you have to do is examine what they're teaching in your children's school.
Yes.
Be a demand for programs that create inclusivity.
Yes.
You know, go in and start groups where you're working with children to teach them about inclusivity, to teach them self-worth. But if we don't start doing that, we're just always like, whack-a-mole, putting out flames
Yes.
and okay, we got this one. Okay, we're jumping on the next fire, as opposed to creating an atmosphere where people thrive.
Yes, and even at a basic level, what we've started with JARC is somewhat akin to Big Brother, Big Sister. So like a mentor pairing.
That's
So
great.
for folks who, for whatever reason, maybe have burned their bridges and can't reconnect with some of those familial relationships, as we both have agreed, everyone needs to feel like they belong somewhere and they are accepted.
Yeah.
So even pairing with a community member just to
That's
spend
right.
time with, or to go out and have coffee, just to know that there is someone in your corner
Yep.
that you can connect with, who is engaging in efforts to understand you.
Yeah.
That's huge for a lot of folks.
We've all heard the stories about people who, they spoke to someone for half an hour and their lives have changed.
Yes.
So, you never know the impact you have. You do know the impact you have when you're nasty and mean. It's
Yes.
obvious right away. But,
Yeah.
when that kind of infusion of acceptance and embracing,
Yes.
it shows up.
Yes, it does.
impacts. So we have like 30 seconds. What would you like to say?
If you don't know where to start, you can give us a call.
Absolutely.
Juvenile and Adult Reentry Connections, www.jarchealth.org. Our phone number is 609-786-2536.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you.
My name is Natasha Sherman. Thank you for joining us.